Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce Lief Erickson.
Roger already mentioned that I was pretty involved with the documentation over the last year or so, and he also mentioned that I was in a master's program in Austria for a content strategy. I chose to write my master's thesis using the DITA-Open Toolkit as my case study organization. I thought there would be some good value in me giving back to the community that I am taking from. So, one of the things that I did was design a question of, would fresh eyes bring some new ideas to this project? And what would that look like? And so my project started a year and a half ago, and some of you participated in, at least I'm assuming some of you participated in a user survey that I had that was up on DITA users and a couple of other places. Got some responses, so that was one of the things I did. Also, I had within a content strategy, there are a number of steps that usually happen, and a stakeholder interview or a stakeholders interview usually happens. This being a small team, the stakeholder was a single person, so I had a chat with him. I also developed a domain model. One of the projects that, since my project was specifically dealing with a taxonomy and search experience, developing a domain model would help inform that work. Next, I gathered some technical data on the number of searches that were happening, as well as doing a term frequency analysis over the DITA-Open Toolkit documentation itself to figure out what the documentation itself considered as important words. Then I developed a couple of different taxonomy structures. Taxonomies can be used in different ways. Can be used for navigation. So you're already all familiar with that left-hand menu. That's one taxonomy. There's taxonomies that can be used for retrieval, and there can be taxonomies for indexing, among others. Then I developed some indexing guidelines after having developed that index, and then there was a usability test that I did of the index, and thanks to those who have participated in that exercise. And then from all of that work, I have some recommendations that I presented to the stakeholder, some of which, as you might expect, was gleefully accepted, and others, there was a thanks, I think. It's a good idea. If you want to do it, we'll talk about it. So one of the first things I did was develop this domain model. This domain model is a draft. It has not been approved. Anything you do with it, this might be complete lies. But I think there's some truth to this. What this does is show what, if you go into the inside of the toolkit code, this is the structure of how the toolkit looks at itself. So you can see that we've got over on the left-hand side an input file. And the input file goes into a processor. The processor could be Saxon, could be FOP, could be Antenna House, and so on. And then you get something out, whatever that might be. It might be your HTML files, it might be your PDF or your JSON, what have you. But the processor all works because there's a bunch of plugins that are there. And the plugins itself has things going into it. And then there are log files that happen. So this was the basic structure I was using for developing sort of a top-level taxonomy. Also, I want to say, if there are any problems with that, I'm not an expert on the different aspects of those areas. There are other people in this room who might be able to provide some more insight or corrections. So the taxonomy work itself, as I mentioned, there were I was looking at existing terms, the domain model, and the technical analysis. I also used a website called Answer the Public. And Answer the Public is a website where you can enter specific search terms that are of interest to you, and it goes out and says, hey, what are the terms that people are searching the internet for along with this term? So I put in DITA-Open Toolkit and DITA-OT and was getting back some information. That information was largely matching what I was also seeing from the search logs that I was also analyzing. There were some differences, but for the most part, there was an awful lot of overlap, and that was affirming. I also looked at our competitors' documentation, and I'm using competitors' documentation very loosely here because I looked at the DITA converter documentation as well as Pandoc, just to see how they would think about the issue. If one steps back and abstracts what is the DITA-Open Toolkit project and what is DITA-Open Toolkit, it is a file converter. It's a publishing tool. It's a publishing tool. So what sort of how do other publishing tools refer to the concepts that we want to address ourselves? And as Roger mentioned, I came up with a basic glossary because as I was going through the documentation myself, I was struggling with different terms, like what does this really mean? Is there a good definition that we could develop? Are there ideas for some controlled vocabulary that we could bring to the table for authors or for ourselves? And are there ways that we can limit how things are, what's available to authors? And one of the ways that we decided to go about doing that was through the use of subject scheme. Roger mentioned earlier that a lot of the code examples have a language value on the output class. And those values were already there, but it would be possible to enter in anything into those values, including things that weren't valid. Valid in the sense of there wouldn't be any styling that would follow on from it. So developed the taxonomy using the subject scheme to control what's available on the output class attribute or in the output class attribute on different elements. And different elements have different values available to them. And this is a working example, and because it's in the DITA-OT docs, if you want to see how we chose to go and add a subject scheme and limit how output class is limited to very specific elements, take a look at this example. So the recommendations, as I mentioned, come in like 3 different areas. The first area that I had recommendations for was for the website itself. And until this morning, this is kind of what the website looked like. And you'll notice that I had to highlight the search box up there because it was pretty difficult to see. And the 4 areas where I had recommendations or thoughts of how the user experience could improve was in first, the banner that's up at the top. If anybody goes to anything that's not the latest version, you're presented with a banner. And the banner just says, you're not on the latest version. And I was saying to myself, well, all right, I know I'm not on the latest version, but which version am I on? Does anybody know how to tell what version you're on? Right, you have to look up in the URL to figure out what version you're on. So my recommendation was, let's find a way to maybe make it a little bit more apparent to the user, let's improve this message to let them know you're on version 2.5 and the latest version is 3.4. Next, the number 2 is I am suggesting that we add some breadcrumbs into the site so we can see where in the structure we're located. Right now, that sort of happens. You can infer it through the table of contents that expands, and that's highlighted. But the next recommendation I actually have is to get rid of that table of contents, because if you fully expand it, you have 250 topics, and that menu just scrolls for ages and becomes really unusable. So the thought I have is, and this is a mock-up, it's a hack of a mock-up, but it's a mock-up of, let's add some tabs across the top, and on mouse over, the tab drops down and you can see the structure, so it is much easier through mousing over just to start to internalize the structure of the documentation. What are your thoughts of that idea? So George is saying right now, well, if the page is small, that you're probably no longer having a mouse over action because maybe you're on a mobile device. This is true. We also know that most of our users do not visit our site on a mobile device. Most of them are on a laptop or a desktop of some sort. So the comment was, do I have hard data saying that the table of contents is fully expanded? No, I don't have that hard data. Follow up? So the comment is that when you come to the site, the menu is completely collapsed and it doesn't expand automatically. But if you come to the site, what page are you on? You're at the top level page, so there's no place for it to go to. Although if you do come into a deeper page from Google, for instance, I think it's expanded. Yeah. Roger is nodding yes. So, George and then Frank. So George, what was your comment? You're all done. Okay. Frank? It's not a finished idea. It's throw something at the wall as something that's different than what is there now and refine it. So, yes. So your suggestion is maybe to have a sidebar available. Yeah, that with the hamburger menu. Okay. Ursula. So your idea is to use word families to dynamically build a structure. Sure. Sure. Okay. Good feedback. There's a fourth recommendation that I have, and the 4 isn't on this screen because the recommendation itself is not going to be visible to the users, to you, but it is, and it's something that has been talked about a little bit already. It is, there's no really good tracking information. And for somebody who wants to make improvements to the site, I want to know what's happening on the site. And so the recommendation is to provide some analytics tracking functionality in some way, shape, or form, or maybe even a couple ways or in shapes and forms. Roger has talked about how he has server logs and how that doesn't require anybody to give their approval, and how there's no GDPR concerns. There's no cookie acceptance that needs to happen. There's other ways that tracking can also happen, one of which is using a tool like Hotjar or a similar tool. And the reason Hotjar would be attractive to me is, although we have a number of short pages in our library, there's also a number of really long pages. How far down are people actually reading on those pages? You know, Hotjar can give us that information and allow us to make decisions about whether the structure of that page is correct or whether it should change in some way. It's a recommendation, and right now we don't have any data to make a decision one way or another about whether to change the structure of those pages. So that was number 4. I guess before I move on, at the risk of divulging your privacy preference one way or another, how does anybody in this room feel about whether, I should add about Hotjar, it is, it and its servers are entirely within the EU, so there's no EU GDPR acceptance that needs to happen there. With all of that said, tracking, pro or con, does anybody want to say one way or another whether they feel like this would be useful or harmful to them personally? That's
yes,
one voice.
so to summarize, you say that if you know the group, then you accept that. But that means, if you are somebody new to the group, so somebody that will be new to the DITA-OT, how that person will feel, They will be kind of, I'm just here and they already want to track me. So my personal opinion will be, what do you do with that information? That's the question. Okay, you track users, but then what decisions, important decision you take based on that? If you do not have that solved, then why bother, you know? And you mentioned that the GDPR thing, but it's also California Privacy Act, which is similar. So it's not that you have only the European issue. You will have soon also with the US. So the problem is more complex.
Without a doubt.
So I'm actually a bit confused. I mean, we aren't tracking users. I think we aren't. What we are tracking is what content gets looked at. And it seems that should make a difference when it comes to GDPR.
You can get that from the several laws.
Maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know. I mean, even cookies, you don't need to use cookies to track users. And GDPR is about tracking users, personally identifiable information.
So to get the statistics for what is read on the website and so on, you can obtain that from the server log. So you don't need to track any. You don't need cookies. You don't need anything.
So George, that would tell me what page has been loaded. It wouldn't tell me where on the page somebody looked. And for the really long pages, I want to know, are they too long? Should we consider making changes to the structure of those topics so that the information that's down on the bottom gets promoted to a higher page?
Usually it's very difficult even if you have, you know, more information, whether someone just loaded the page and, you know, scrolled and left it and for lunch and then came back and what do you get from that? I was telling Jarno yesterday, I think, when we had a chat that about statistics and all that, I was at a meeting with someone from the Microsoft Excel team and they had this kind of information and they noticed that some action was really very highly used. But then when they analyzed more, the next action was undo. Right, so if you just look at some information, you may get, that may lead you to a wrong decision. So, you know, it's...
So really the question I'm asking is a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem that needs to be addressed. It's like, how can I know whether to make changes on the website if I don't have any data to validate any hypothesis that I have? So I would want the data to tell me ahead of time, I have a question, and it validates one hypothesis.
So one thing that you can do is to check the search terms and maybe see what are the results for those search terms and see if the topics that they found respond to those questions.
Sure.
So that's probably the best thing to do.
So let's talk about that. So the search experience was another thing I looked at. And just some quick numbers over the last 12 months. So from the end of October 2018 to the end of October 2019, there were 4,450 searches done on the website, which comes out to about 85 a week. 10 to 15% of those search terms resulted in no hits at all in the documentation. So there were probably the personally identifiable information that Roger was reading, among others. Searches were also performed, although the site is only in English, searches were performed in Russian, German, Japanese, Croatian, among others. Not sure why, but that was the case. Before I go on to talk about some of what I found, does anybody have any comments on what this search experience has been like on the site for them?
The art of doing nothing. The art of
Sorry.
I actually have searched during commutes on my mobile device, and I'm curious about whether you're still on the train or if you're willing to go into the plane. I found what I needed, and yeah, when you're looking at technical information, of course, you want a bigger real estate to sort of. I actually printed everything out just because I want to mark it up. I want to make notes. I want to see, what have I not understood? I want to have these cognitive connections happening, these neurological things in my brain so I can understand this content more thoroughly. So I use both hard copy and mobile, and then online, so everything. And I think it's pretty good. I think there's obviously room for improvement, but I think it would be interesting to maybe not undervalue the mobile experience and be maybe a little bit more mobile focused.
All right.
My only comment was that as somewhat of an advanced user, I tend to go into the docs trying to remember what parameter names are called, and that works so much better now that our definition terms are indexed. That's the primary thing I go there for.
Oh, and just a quick thank you for the index, because I did look for that, and I couldn't find it, obviously, in my PDF that I printed out. So
Because it didn't exist until
much
today.
much appreciation for that.
Technically. Anybody else want to comment on what their search experience has been like on the website? Everybody's happy or everybody hates it, one or the other? All right, we got a couple more people.
Yeah, I'm very sorry to say it, but for me, the search experience was really just not great. I never found what I was looking for. As I can say that really in general. I was often led to older documentation. So when I looked for a search term, it suddenly there was a result appeared that told me, yeah, in version 2.3 you find blah, blah, blah. And I was looking for 2.4. For example.
Sure.
May I ask, were you searching through the site search mechanism or through a web search?
The search field, yeah.
So for the recording, Roger asked whether she was searching through the Google or through the site search, and she responded with site search.
Yeah, so I was going to comment on that, actually. Yeah, the way I typically search is not through site searches, but through Google. I mean, I Google everything. And if I know that the chance is higher to find it on a specific site, I might put that into Google as well. So I think whatever we do to search should also work well with Google.
Sure. Yep. Okay. So as we've already talked about, our site search was not working because the working theory I had and the working theory that I published in my master's thesis is that what I had identified was search terms with periods were not coming up. And I failed horribly with my confirmation bias of words with periods must be a problem. Turns out that wasn't the case. Turns out it was actually much worse than that. Turns out we weren't indexing whole swaths of content because of the elements they were living in, not because a period is a stop character. So lesson learned, I jumped too quickly to my confirmation bias. So that which couldn't be indexed also couldn't be found. Now that we have some index terms, we have searchable metadata, and those index terms now are indexed and can be searched. Meaning, even if the word doesn't appear on the page itself, the page will return as a hit for that specific search term. So this is a way that we can start to add in synonyms, and it doesn't have to be through the index term. There's also potentially other metadata elements that we could use in that place. So as Roger mentioned, we had some popular search terms. And again, the total number of queries, and then the words that people were searching for. Does anybody see anything interesting on this list? I mean, Roger commented a little bit about it, but I guess the thing is there anything that strikes you about, like if you were to look at this list, is it, what jumps out? DITA? Anybody have an idea?
You are waiting for the markdown answer, probably.
Yeah, markdown's up there really high. It really honestly surprises me that DITA-val is the number one and not even close. DITA, I am presuming, I don't know this, but I am presuming they're not actually searching for DITA, the specification. I'm assuming they're searching for the DITA command, but I don't know. Since we're in the DITA Open Toolkit and there is a DITA command in the DITA Open Toolkit, it's my assumption, but it could be that someone's searching for DITA, the specification. Don't know. Fair enough. So the top 10 search results. This was one of the usability issues that I thought existed was that you could only see the top 5 until just very recently. And the top 5 wasn't providing enough context for search results that have a lot of hits. I don't think necessarily that the top 10 is enough. There are ways that I feel like this is probably just a stopgap, the fact that there's now 10. I think we're probably going to continue to look at this usability and find ways to improve it so that you can, if you're searching for a term that has a lot of hits and you're looking for something very specific within that list, you can scroll through your results or page through results until you find the result that looks most interesting to you if it is not within the top 5 or 10. However, this is choosing to get displayed. But there was a change made to make it go from 5 to 10. Another area that I looked at was the indexing, as we mentioned, and metadata. And that index has 3,159 entries in it now, which, as I mentioned, is newly searchable content. And it was tested. The index was tested. I developed some questions, some easy, some a little more challenging, where my test participants had to use nothing but the index to find the answer to the question. There was mixed results, and I don't know if the mixed results were because of my question or because of other aspects of the test itself. But as Roger mentioned, we now have index and index metadata, which means we have a PDF index, which was a goal of the project for a good long time, although if I refer back to the user survey that I did 15 months ago, users were not particularly begging for a PDF index. They were more interested in actually having an HTML index rather over a PDF index. Good news, we can expose these index entries on the website as well. And as Robert mentioned earlier, this did lead to my developing the index entries did lead to me stumbling across a few issues in the Open Toolkit, and I was not certain whether it was me or whether it was something else. And it turns out both were true. It was problems with the DITA-Open toolkit as well as problems with my own understanding about how some things were supposed to work. One of the challenges that some people had in my test for the index was finding the page number on some pages within the documentation. I don't know if anybody spends a lot of time with the PDF, probably don't, but there are 2 sections within the PDF document that for 25 pages or more, there is not a single page number. Twice. I don't know if it's an issue for finding information. It's certainly not if you use Control F, but if you are searching from the index to a page number, it does become a little more difficult. So these are just 3 examples of pages. You're in the default layout, the start page of the chapter, of the part, and also some other pages don't have page numbers. Roger? Sure.
So all of these observations are correct. I should point out that it's not quite as bad as those screenshots suggest. We cheat a little bit. And Lief apparently built those using the default settings. And because those default settings are rather unflattering, when we build the distribution version of the documentation, we actually don't use that page layout that we see in those screenshots. So we get rid of the mini talk and we use the full page width. So there's not 25 pages with no page numbers, it's probably 23. So to be fair, this is a problem, but it doesn't look quite that bad.
Your Honor, I didn't stab him in the back. I shot him in the head. Is that what you're saying? And then the last recommendation that I have for the project is we're not great marketers. We've talked about this many times, and I think we could do a better job of socializing the changes that we make within the project, within the documentation, within the tool itself. And right now, I'm sure there's all sorts of activity happening on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook or what have you. And if history is any indicator of the future, in a few days, that'll all stop until the next release. My recommendation is let's parse out some of our recommendations, our thoughts on what this release is all about. So rather than just blowing it all out today, which, it's good to have a nice big announcement, but, maybe next week we tweet out something about the project file. And then maybe a week after that, a link about, the index or something else. Just so that there's, a drip, 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 so we're not forgotten. So those are my recommendations and the experience of putting together a master's thesis using the DITA-Open toolkit as the case study. Any questions?
And we'll record them. Well, I think there are enough questions during the talk, I guess. So, we have one.
Just say one word about how you compile the index entries, because that struck me quite interesting when you...
How did I compile the index entries? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I used a lot of different tools to figure out what the important subjects were. And then it was a very manual, very laborious process of creating all of the index entries. It took me over 3 weeks of full-time work to do that.
I have one thing. You talked about the index entries that resulted in, some of them were your issues understanding, confusing stuff from the spec maybe.
Yeah.
Some of them were toolkit issues. At least one of them sort of blurs the line between toolkit issue and technically FOP issue, where we put in the right index markup and all of a sudden FOP has a bunch of big space, but fortunately we're able to work around that in the toolkit. So the question really actually is about page numbers. Do you know if that might be an FOP issue? Did you try that with Antenna House and RenderX, or is that something else that...
As a lowly graduate student, I did not have access to fancy tools like Antenna House, so...
More or less what I expected, and I mean, we do build our docs with FOP, and we'll continue to do so because we want to use the free tools, but...
Also, slightly above in PDF2's handling of parts, because most people use chapters, not parts. And if you actually stick a lot of content into the first topic of the part in bookmap, you sort of hit a condition that we haven't really tested. So it's a bug.
That's a very reasonable hypothesis. Because, the reason I feel like that, I can confirm that, is when I look through the pages, what I notice where my perhaps incorrect layout changes is when there is a topic heading. So that's why I feel like you're probably correct there.
You mentioned there were some search words in different languages.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be that they were looking at the translation of the site?
There is no translation of the site.
With Google, whatever.
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, why? I'm not sure why somebody, because these were site searches on our site rather than...
Yeah, but in the browser you can just click the Google
I
Translate
suppose.
and you get the website live
Entirely
in the language.
possible. Yeah. One thing, I guess, since I have a couple minutes, one thing that I did want to address that I forgot to on the search experience, and this is actually rather important, is how we're looking at changing the site search, and that's adding facets. The one facet that is immediately obvious to me is adding the ability to filter on versions. Would that be interesting to anybody? So I'm seeing a little bit more head nodding and a couple of thumbs up. Are there any other dimensions that would be interesting to you for filters or facets?
By domains or topic types?
By domains or topic types, okay. So you might want to be able to search for all of the tasks.
Mostly for references, like
Okay.
per element.
Okay.
Mostly for references.
Okay, references, okay. All right. Any other dimensions that might be interesting? Well, I think Roger and I successfully filled up the time, and now it's a coffee break, George? Is that right?
Yes!